Associate Professor of the Ateneo School of Government. Prior joining ASOG, she was a fellow at the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. And her research is focused on rule of law, judicial politics, and gender, legal pluralism, hybrid justice, and security in Southeast Asia. Let us all welcome Dr. Imelda Deinla of BOSES Pilipinas and Ateneo School of Government.
It was really very interesting to hear what SAC had just presented in terms of some systematic biases in the surveys, especially in relation to how it affects perception on democracy and governance in countries in Africa. And of course, the Philippines is probably more or less similarly situated in terms of the context. But my presentation today is really more about the Philippines. And as you can see on the title, it's about politics and elections. And lastly is the public opinion. So this is intentional in terms of my title because more often, probably the systematic biases on public opinion in the Philippines probably would come from politics and the elections itself. So I'm talking about here, like posing the question about whether really public opinion or opinion polls are actually public opinion, because often these two words or phrases are conflated. And there's somehow already the distinction is lost between these two words. But for me, there is a huge distinction, and especially for me, opinion polls, of course, we present it as, scientifically representative of a certain universe of our population. But we know first and foremost that it probably in many ways only reflect probably a snapshot of public opinion. And because that is coming from the inherent limitations of surveys themselves or opinion polling. And that limitations are reflected, first of all, in the fact that respondents come from a very tiny fraction of the entire universe or population. Secondly, questions are very simple, they are straightforward, and that there is really no space for respondents to explain their response or to even argue or debate the kind of questions that are posed to them. But number three, often most of the surveys contain very little information about the subject matter itself. So in fact, a lot of surveys in a lot of the literature say that most of these surveys were actually coming from, like the respondents have very little knowledge or no knowledge at all of the information or the subject that's being asked of them. In the context of the Philippines, of course, opinion polls has become very important and in fact become an integral part of Philippine politics. So much so that election polls actually are part of the political discourse, part of a lot of contention among different groups in Philippine politics. But if we actually look back, public opinions, as observed by Headman in 2010, was that public opinion polls was actually used as a tool for political mobilization, especially in the period of democratization. But we should note that during that time, during the fight against the dictatorship, public opinion polls were just one of the public's opinions, and a lot of the public opinion, the voices of the people were actually expressed in different forms, such as protests, strikes, debates, fora, and the like. So at the time, public opinion polls was just, one of the means to express what the public think about the government and the policies. But we know that since then, during democratization process and up to now, opinion polls have gained so much traction. Yeah. So if you see this slide, and we know that there are also a lot of authors that look at the transformative characteristic or feature of opinion polls. And in the context of the Philippines, some observers would say that it actually opened up the space for non-traditional players in Philippine politics, particularly national elective officials. So if you look on the right side, there is actually something in common about these five personalities. Many of them, the five of them, to the smaller or greater extent, have not really come from the traditional politicians, meaning the dynastic political clans, the influential hacienderos, or those who are very close to the political and economic elites. So these five candidates actually became popular, probably on their own, but they were also products of media, of popularity. So, but on the other hand, we know that public opinion polls can actually have the potential also to amplify existing deficits of liberal democracy. And in the Philippines, we know that still we are dominated by clientelistic and dynastic kind of politics. And again, some of those, maybe two of those in the photos probably would represent to a smaller extent clientelism and populism. But of course, we know that opinion polling could also lead to political branding and populism, and that is what is happening now to many of those seemingly unknown candidates that are actually that are floated, especially before announcement of elections. Many of those personalities are actually floated to see whether they are bankable. It's as if they are really stars, and of course, we know that the implication of this is that this could affect the support, particularly in terms of resources, that candidates might get from certain sectors or groups. Of course, the sad part of this is this: it would, if the candidates are actually not seen as bankable or viable, then they can actually be excluded, even if they are actually worthy candidates, or would be dissuaded from participating in the elections. And we can see that happening now with, for example, maybe VP Lenny is still really thinking about her bankability or her viability in running for the presidency. Correct me if I'm wrong in that sort of assessment. We know as well that beyond the inherent limitations of the surveys is that fake news and public opinion have this afflictive relationship. And we know that fake news, even a small part of it, could actually affect or influence public opinion. Also, that when public opinion is taken as definitive, it creates exclusion of other voices, for example, probably more informed voices. And that also in the case of many other countries, well, it's been shown as well in the US, is that it could create actually a certain degree of polarization. Of course, we know that the negative effect of elite leadership on public opinion. So it's not just, of course, we know in the literature that elite leadership has some positive contribution, but for me, elite leadership has a different impact on some jurisdictions. For example, in the Philippines, where politicians and interest groups are using PR firms, media, of course, SOCMED influencers and specialists in shaping public opinion. And so we are also now looking at the shift, in fact, of public policy that are based in this so-called popular opinion. For example, the war on drugs and on death penalty becoming really one of the more popular agenda of politicians, of the government, for example, just because this rate very high in the opinion polls. So in terms of, I think many of you are familiar already with BOSES Pilipinas, but for some who are not familiar, so this is the reason why BOSES Pilipinas, the Ateneo's survey unit, and the first university-based survey research in opinion polls and survey research in the Philippines, is veering away from the traditional sort of polling practices that many of Filipinos are familiar with. So with BOSES Pilipinas, we are basically focusing on rigorous survey research. And we have done what we have done more recently was our youth Pinoy Voters Vibe Survey, which is to analyze how our youth, how Filipino youths have been actually been vulnerable to fake news. And in the preliminary results, we know that the Filipino youths, even though they are educated, are actually very susceptible to fake news, and this actually affects the way they perceive their candidates, but also in terms of their preferences towards those candidates. So BOSES Pilipinas' goal is to foster communication between public and government on policy issues, and that is by generating credible data and analyzing those data. We wanted to also create those safe spaces for political and social dialogues, such as what we are doing now, because I think one of the key findings in our survey is that really fake news has really created deep division within Filipinos. So looking now at the Philippine elections, and we know that it's heating up even before candidates actually formally announce their candidacies. That we know that public opinion would really play a very, very influential role in it. So I see both challenges and opportunities for the 2022 elections, especially for BOSES Pilipinas. The two challenges that I am, of course, that I have listed here are those pertaining to our survey process and methodology. And that is the limitations that pandemic has imposed on many of us. I don't, and I think Zach already mentioned about the non-response rates. That's really very important and actually are not reported by many of these survey firms. But we know that intuitively that the pandemic really has this capacity to constrain and increase the biases in our surveys. Of course, we know that there are a lot of other surveys outfits. Most of them are fly-by-night ones that would just come and go during elections, but with the purpose of really probably finding out for the benefit of certain candidates whether their candidates are bankable or viable or not. Of course, some of these outfits may also have some intention of manipulating public perception. And so the question of, do we regulate public polling, opinion polling? And it is one issue that has also been raised in response to controversies on Philippine public polling. But I won't deal with that. In terms of of course, the opportunities, we now have access to technology and information that can actually allow us to innovate. Beyond, of course, the comforts, beyond the inconvenience, of course, that we are experiencing now, we have technology and communication platforms that we can actually use to sort of present a different view of what is public opinion, or to conduct more rigorous way of doing public polling. And of course, I have highlighted here, of course, the need to be more innovative. I was actually like asking myself, why is it that it's easy for the influencers to be actually be heard by a lot of people? I'm not saying that we should adopt the way the influencers peddle their information to influence the public. But I know that we in the civil society, in the academe, actually have more tools, more innovative tools to use. I think it's just a matter of really finding out how we can probably do it in an effective and efficient way. And that we have that wider platform now to reach out, educate, and engage not just our own group, but of course going out of our group to actually reach out to the broader public. But beyond, of course, the survey processes, I think really the challenge and opportunity for us during these Philippine elections is to how we can actually reorient public opinion towards its more deliberative function, meaning being a positive instrument for more relevant, more responsive democracy and governance. But also in how we can actually use public opinion polls on how to actually create informed political mobilization, especially at these times of fake news, and misinformation. So I think that's all for now, and happy to receive your questions later. Thank you.
Alamin kung ano ang mga kasalukuyang ginagawa ng Participate. Bumisita lamang sa inclusivedemocracy.ph at i-follow ang aming social media accounts.